Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to look at the last two types of iteration or looping. The last time we talked about the repeat loop or the repeat block, which is where you simply have a certain section of code that repeats a specific number of times. And this was the program that we made to have this sprite move from corner to corner. We had the exact same code and it repeated 4 times when button A is pressed. Now today we're going to look at the for loop, and the advantage of a for loop as opposed to just a standard repeat block is every time it loops, every time your section of code repeats, it can change slightly because you have something called an index, and that index will change every time it goes through that loop, which adds a lot more functionality and a lot more you can do with it compared to just a standard repeat block. So in this case, we are going to use it to move that sprite around the screen, but we're going to have it go across the top row, then the second row, then the third row, then the fourth row. And that's a little harder to do with just a standard repeat block. So in this case, we're going to use a for loop. So just a real quick bit about this before we get started. It says the for loop is useful when you have a variable in your loop that you want to increment each time through. In other words, the first time you go through it's 0, the second time it's 1, then it's 2, then it's 3, then it's 4, so on and so forth. So in this program, we're going to use a for loop to make that LED move across the screen from left to right, top to bottom. And over here on the right, this is what's called the pseudocode. So it's human readable language that represents what the code will do. So we want to turn off the LED at 0, 0. Sorry, turn on the LED at 0, 0, then turn it off, then turn it on at 1, 1, turn it off at 1, 1. Sorry, 1, 0. Man, I can't English today. Turn it on at 1, 0, turn it off at 1, 0, and so on and so forth, as you can read here. So this will be the first time through the loop. We want it to do this. So that will turn on the top left, and then the one to the right of that, to the right of that, to the right of that, all the way through the first row. After that's done, we want it to move to the second row, which would be the, which would be a variable of 2, or sorry, a variable of 1 here, because we start at 0. So the second one actually has a value of 1. So we want to repeat this whole thing, but have a 1 over for our y-axis. And then we want it to repeat again with a 2 in our y-axis, and then 3, and then 4. And this is the value of the for loop, is we can do that. We can have a loop to where every time it adds 1 to a specific variable. So this is the basic setup of the code. And there's some hints over here. I'm not actually going to make you figure it out on your own. If you want, you can look at this, pause the video, try and figure it out and make it on your own, and then come back and see if you did it right, or you can just follow along. Either way is fine. But the basic setup for a for loop is you have for index from 0 to, and then whatever value you put in here. So index is a variable, and it's going to start that variable at 0, and then after it finishes this loop and comes back to the beginning, it's going to increment. In other words, it's going to add 1. So the second time you run through, index will be 1. It'll come back, then index will be 2, and then index will be 3, and then 4. And after it gets to 4 and goes all the way through, it'll come back and see, oh, it's at 5 now. 5 is greater than 4, so I'm done with my for loop, and it's going to quit. And it's going to exit out and do the next line of code. So this is going to be the basic setup. But instead of using the variable index, we're going to use the variable x that we'll create and the variable y that we create. So we're actually going to use 2 of our for loops. So once again, if you want to figure it out on your own, now's the time to try it out. Otherwise, just pause and, well, not pause, just keep following along with the video and we'll do it together. So let me get over to make code. So in this case, instead of using an input to activate the loop, we're just going to have it loop forever. So we're going to use this forever block instead of an input. But you could do the exact same code that we have and put it in one of these inputs, and then it will do the whole sequence only after you press a button or after you shake or things like that. So first thing we need to do is we need to create our new variables. So we're going to make a variable. And the first one we're going to call x, and that's going to keep track of the x coordinate. And then we're going to make another variable and we're going to call it y, and that will keep track of the y coordinate. So now we have an x and we have a y. And we want to drag this set block into onStart, and then I'll right click and duplicate, and then change this to x, because when the program first starts, we want x to be 0 and y to be 0. That way it starts right here. And then we'll change it to where it'll do its thing. But when the program first starts, we want x and y to both be 0. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more just to make it easier to read. So from here, now we're going to go to our forever block, and we need our for loop. So if you click on loops, you'll see this for index from 0 to 4. I'm going to click and drag that into my forever block. And now it default has this index variable, but we want to use our variables. So I'm actually going to right click on index, and then you'll see I can actually pick from the variables I've already created. So I want to change that to x. And now what this loop is going to do is it's going to change the x variable, and the first time through it'll be 0, and then the second time it'll be 1, and then 2, then 3, then 4, and then after it's 4 and goes to 5, it exits and continues along with the rest of the code. And notice when I hover over this block, it explains what it's doing. So I have the variable x take on the values from 0 to the end number, which is 4, counting by 1, and do the specified blocks. So unlike our other program where we used a sprite, this time we're simply going to turn on a LED at a specific coordinate and then turn it off, which is what we saw in this program. So we're going to use the plot x and y and then unplot x and y with a pause in between. So what plot does is it simply turns the LED on at that point. So I just got to remember where that plot is. Oh, it's under LED. Silly me. So when you have LED specific commands, it's under LED. Surprise, surprise. So they've got lots of different things. You can actually adjust brightness, which is kind of fun, but we won't use that right now. We're just going to use this plot. So plot will turn the LED on as you hover over it. It shows you. And then unplot will turn that LED off. So first we need a plot, x and y. And then I'm going to come over here to basic and pause and drag a pause block in there. And then we need our unplot. And then we want another pause. So right now you see we've created this LED. It's blinking because if we go slowly and see how the code executes, it's going here, then it turns it on, it pauses, it turns it off, it pauses. On, pause, off, pause. And it's going to repeat that 5 different times, and then it goes back to the forever block. Now, we don't want it to just sit there and blink. We want it to move down. So turn this one on, then off, then this one on and off, this one on and off, so on and so forth. So looking here, instead of setting x and y to 0 and 0, this is where we can use our variables. And this shows the power of variables again. So instead of plot x being 0, I'm going to click and drag in my x variable for both my plot and unplot. So now as x changes, this is going to change as well. So the first time through, this is going to be 0 and 0. So this one will turn on. The second time through, it adds 1. So this will be 1 and 1. So this one will turn on and off. And then 2 and then 2, then 3 and then 3, and then 4 and then 4, and so on and so forth, until it gets all the way to 5. Once it gets to 5, it exits. It goes back to the forever block, and this resets. So when I press play, we should see the LED start here and move across that top row. And sure enough, that's exactly what it does. You can even do it in slow motion. That way you can follow along with the code and see why it does that. And you'll see that every time that for loop goes through, it's adding 1 to the x, which is why it moves across, because this is 0, 0, then 1, 0, then 2, 0, then 3, 0, then 4, 0. And then it exits out, goes to the forever, starts this over again, starts back at 0, 0. So we've got it moving across the first line. Now what we want it to do is once it gets to the end, we want it to start on the second row and move across. So think about it for just a sec. What do you think we need to do in order for it, after it's done with this, to move on to the second row? So hopefully what you thought of is, hey, we need another for loop. So I'm going to grab another one of these for loops, and I'm going to drag it on the outside. So we've got one for loop here, another for loop here. So this one is inside of that one. And we want to change this for loop by right-clicking to change our y variable. And then in here, we're going to drag y to our y for the plotting. And now you'll see it goes all the way across, all the way down, and then starts over again. If I do it in slow motion, you'll see what's happening. So it starts this for loop, y is 0. So these will both be 0. And then it starts this for loop, sets x to 0. So it's 0, 0. And then 1, 0, 1, 0. And then 2, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 3, 0, 4, 0, 4, 0. Then it finishes that, comes back here. This adds 1. So now y, instead of being 0, is 1. And then it's 0, 1, 0, 1. And then 1, 1. And then 2, 1. Then 3, 1. Then 4, 1. Then exits, goes back here. Now this is 2. So 0, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 2, 4, 2. Exits again. And this becomes 3. And it just keeps doing that until it goes all the way around and gets to the very bottom. So in slow motion, you can follow that and track it. Or if I disable slow-mo, you just see what it does. So this is our simple program for a for loop. And I forgot to change the name at the very beginning, so let's do that now. For loop moving dot is what I'm going to call it. And once again, I would make sure you save it. So download it. Save that .hex file to your Google Drive. That way you can always have access to it and re-import it if you need to. But that's the for loop. One thing, and here's our completed program here as well. So here's some optional mods that you can do. Change it up and see if maybe instead of having it move across the row and then to the next row and then to the next row, maybe you try and have it go down the columns. So what happens if you switch these two loops? How does that change things? Maybe see if you can change it to where it moves this way and then down and then this way and then down and then this way and then down and then that way. That one's a lot more complex, but it's a really cool trick that you can do. But just play with it. Maybe you remove the pauses and see what happens. So there's some modifications you can do to make this even more interesting. So that's the for loop. It's an iterator where your value changes each time. So now we're going to do one more program. This one's very quick and easy. We're going to use the while loop. So the advantage of the while loop is it will repeat while a certain condition is true. That's why it's called a while loop. In this case, we're going to use a while loop to create an alarm. If you had a physical microbit, you'd need to connect headphones or a speaker to it like this in order for it to play. But let's go ahead and create the while loop program. So I'm going to click on microbit to get back to my main page, click on new project, and then I'm going to call it while loop door alarm. And in this program, this is what we're going to do. So we are going to activate our door alarm by shaking it. And then we're going to check and see whether or not button A is pressed. And while it's not being pressed, it's going to repeat this. So I'll kind of explain it as we're building it. So I actually don't need this. Don't need this. I'm going to get rid of both. What we want is on shake. So in other words, your alarm won't go off until the microbit gets shaken. So your door opens, that shakes the microbit, and the alarm is going to start going off. That's why we're using this input. Now if I go to my loops, I'm going to get this one, while true. And the idea behind while true is whatever value you have in here, remember that's a conditional. As long as this value is true, it's going to do whatever is in the middle here. So after the microbit is shaken, we want it to repeat our alarm until you press the A button. So we're going to use a little bit of logic to figure that one out. So I need to click on logic, and I want to go down here and get this not. So what a not does is it's checking for the opposite. So while I'm not, and then go to my input, pressing button A, come on, there we go. So while I'm not pressing button A, my alarm is going to go off, which in this case, it's playing two different notes for half a beat, middle C and high C. Now to get to your music, it's under music, and we're going to play specific tones. So play tone middle C for a half a beat. And then I'm going to drag another one of these out here, and instead of middle C, you can pick any tones you want. I'm going to do what they have though, which is high C for a half a beat. So you can put in any tone, any music, any combination you'd like. But now when I shake the microbit, I've opened the door, my alarm's going to go off because of this while loop. Because while I'm not pressing A, it's going to repeat this over and over and over. So I shake my microbit. It's an alarm. You may or may not be able to hear that because of zoom, but it continues to go on until I have to press and hold A. And the reason being is you have to have button A pressed once it gets back to this point. So you have to press and hold it for a little bit to get it to turn off, but eventually the alarm will turn off because it'll check and it'll see, oh, button A is pressed, so this is no longer true, so I no longer am going to do what's in the while loop. And that's the idea behind a while loop, is it's going to continue to run while that condition is true. And in this case, our condition is you're not pressing button A. So go ahead, build that. You can play with this as well. There's a lot of expansions on it. But those are our two programs to demonstrate the while loop and the for loop. Two very powerful tools in your programming tool bag.